Hi, I'm Carolyn. In our talk on 21st century learning today, our focus will be on context, i.e. the environment in which learning takes place and the way in which we present information to students. The key idea concerning context is that it should be student-friendly. This seems obvious and is something most teachers try to practice. But what does it mean? We need to look at several areas to answer this question. Focus and engagement level, people and characters, age and subjects, interaction, and country-specific requirements. So let's look at focus and engagement first. In order to work out what student-friendly actually means, we need to begin by looking at the students themselves. The main fact is teenagers find it hard to focus. Their brains are changing literally, so they're easily distracted and more emotional. Usually, the context of their lives is more important to them than the context of learning. That's normal, and it's always been the case, but it's actually made worse by the range of distractions available at the touch of a button. This has implications for 21st century teachers. We all need to know about something called the brain switch. When you see glazed eyes, hear your students fidgeting or whispering to neighbours, these small signs of disengagement trigger alarm bells. But did you know that when students' attention seems to be wandering, their brain may literally be switching off? According to recent research, surprisingly, students are not even in control of this switch. It can be linked to the type of task they're doing at the time. Researchers at the University of Michigan discovered that boredom can actually cause parts of the brain to switch off. They monitored brain activity of volunteers as they identified letter after letter flashing up on a screen. This monotonous task caused volunteers' reaction times to slow right down as they lost concentration. When this occurred, the activity between parts of the brain in charge of self-control, vision, and language processing died down almost completely. And according to scientists, this is like the brain switching off these functions. In other words, boredom actually prevents students from paying attention and therefore from learning. So staying switched on, how do we avoid this switch off happening to our students in the language classroom? Well, it's probably unrealistic to expect all students to be fully switched on all the time, but we can maximise our chances. The fundamental challenge when developing a new course is to come up with an exciting, purposeful context to provide a key element of motivation for students. This is the ideal scenario for any teacher. It sets up a kind of virtuous circle for the classroom environment, which goes something like this. Learner motivation leads to better concentration. This leads to effective learning, then improved learner confidence, and finally that leads to greater involvement and improved motivation. So you keep going round in this kind of virtuous circle. So keeping students in the engagement zone is something we really need to look at and is key to 21st century learning. This isn't new, but it does seem to be more important now. When students lack proper guidance in the classroom, what happens? Mastering content and skills may seem too much of a challenge for them. This leads to frustration, but on the other hand, if content is too easy and provides no challenge, students risk becoming apathetic. So for really effective learning, students need to spend most of their classroom time in this engagement zone. If you have tools and material that maximise the chance of achieving this kind of focus, you're onto a good thing. Think about people and characters first. If you think back to the books you used at school and how modern ELT course books are different, it may give you an idea of what student-friendly can mean. Personally, I was lucky when I was learning French at school that our course book was centred around the family life of a lad called Charles. and that made it instantly relatable. But not all course books were quite that engaging. So having a familiar character of a similar age to identify with definitely helps us absorb language points. Moving on to age and subjects, we also now take this for granted because generally ELT books are a good standard. But when I was teaching EFL myself, I once had to use a course book designed for adults with classes of teenagers. And at the beginning of each week, the school owner would kindly sit me down, go through the lessons and point out how we could make the material more accessible and understandable for the students. And that was definitely an uphill struggle for all concerned, and it was obvious, so we're not really using the right material for those students. So a student-friendly context means also subjects that are interesting for students and appropriate to their age. Looking at level, a student-friendly context is also a context that's at the level of the student. Although we clearly shouldn't pitch language too high so that students struggle, the opposite is also a problem. So if you ask students to have a conversation with other students and it seems childish to them, they probably will complain. It's obvious that a low language level is very hard. It's very hard to talk on different topics in a foreign language, but dumbing down to a very low level also needs to be avoided. One obvious way of avoiding this is to include interesting, interdisciplinary or cultural subjects, or subjects related to interesting people and events, even at the lower levels, because students feel motivated if we treat them seriously. So interaction in the classroom. The contemporary context should encourage interaction, and it's a key way to ensure focus. So interaction and communication are obviously the main objectives of learning a foreign language. And of course, language teachers know that we learn primarily through conversation, but we also need to encourage other forms of interaction in a foreign language. These could be things like discussions, maybe an exchange of emails or posts, entries on Facebook or Twitter, a presentation in a PowerPoint, or use of various messaging services. Luckily for us, today's students are constantly expressing themselves and reacting to things and offering opinions in their own language. So much of this should come fairly naturally to them once they get used to it in a classroom context. And finally, briefly, some teachers need to think about country-specific requirements. So on top of all the other aspects of context we've talked about, teachers in different countries may also need to present material which is compatible with government guidelines or official assessments of ability. But somehow there's a benefit even there. Knowing that they're working to guidelines and making progress through assessments is actually quite motivating for most students. So it's part of our responsibility as teachers to support them effectively in this. In conclusion, a proper learning context is an amazing motivational tool, a context that is student-friendly, i.e. close to the students and brings them closer to the world and the world around them, a context that entails a need for interaction and teaches communication is a must for 21st century learning.
So, that completes our series of short talks on 21st century learning.
We hope you found them useful.
And thank you for joining us.
Thank you.